gonna start.
All right, welcome everybody. And anyone on the team that's monitoring the webinar, let me know if there's tech issues I need to address. But otherwise, I am thrilled to be with you all for the next roughly 45 minutes. My name is Brandy Simonson, and I have the privilege of co-directing the Center on PBIS. And we get to spend the next a little bit of time talking about how to develop and build effective environments. And I thought it would be nice just to do a little bit of a check-in about how we're feeling as we think about fall. So obviously we can't participate live. Some of you are watching this live and others will watch a recording. So just kind of in your head, think about some of the descriptive words you might use as you're projecting ahead for fall. And this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but as I've talked to people, I hear this blend of really stressed out emotions and really optimistic or hopeful emotions. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is I cycle through all of these on a pretty regular basis. But some of what a lot of us are experiencing when we're in times of uncertainty or crisis is that we feel a little bit lost. So we cycle through various places in our minds and in our emotions, but we're often wishing that we had clearer direction. So I keep finding myself kind of wishing that we had a roadmap or a pathway to get us through the next set of months. And so I used that as a starting place for the talk today, to think about in times of uncertainty. I think we have opportunities to create structure, routines, predictability, and some level of certainty for ourselves, given all of the work that we know and do on a regular basis. So I wanted to start a little bit kind of with the map analogy of thinking where we are now. So talk a little bit about the context, and then continuing with that analogy, use our guiding principles kind of as our compass for the work. So where are we heading and how are we going to make decisions? I was thinking within a map, the implementation cascade, so thinking state, district, down to school, gets us to think about kind of the zoom on a map. So what level of implementation are we thinking about? And then thinking about the systems that we have in place at the district, state, district, school, and classroom levels, and also those practices that we're going to support the implementation of. And given that we are in this time of feeling a little bit overwhelmed, I also wanted to simplify and have us focus on watch for 3 key things. So at the end, we're going to come back and kind of think about collecting those keys that are going to set us up for success next year. But I'm going to share more than just 3 things with you in the next 45 minutes. So all of the resources and conversation we're going to have today is grounded in some of the work that was put together by a team, both from the National Center on PBIS, which is showing right now. So I just want to acknowledge Steve Goodman, Jen Freeman, and Susan Barrett, among many others who have collaborated with us on this work in really thinking about the return to school. And we were very fortunate not just to have to work within our own center, but a lot of the comments that I'll make today also reflect the work and contributions of the CISUP Center, the National Integrated MTSS Research Network, the National Center on Improving Literacy, and the Lead for Literacy Center. So we have learned so much by partnering across these different organizations. And again, thanks to all of the collaborators who have made this work possible. So again, thinking about where we are now, we're going to talk a little bit about the context. And I think a lot of what we hear in the media and a lot of what we spend time thinking about are some of the challenges. So I just popped up a few headlines. So we hear concerns about the COVID slide. We think in particular about our students with disabilities or those at risk who might experience greater loss from not being connected to supports. We also think about, again, what this is going to present for us as we come back to fall. So there's lots of reasons to be worried or concerned. But on the flip side, we're seeing a lot of organizations think about how this pause in our education or disruption in our education presents an opportunity for us to think about what has been working and for whom it's been working. And as the pandemic has also highlighted disproportionate impacts on different communities, we've seen our nation come together around movements like Black Lives Matter to really highlight the importance of making sure that everything, and for us today, schooling, works for all students. So really being thoughtful about this opportunity to pause, reflect, not throw things out that have been working, but really interrogate what has been working and has it been working in an equitable way. So for us, we're trying to take an optimistic view and see this as an opportunity for us to double down on what we know works and retool, tweak, or enhance those things that we know have maybe not been working as consistently. So with that, the guidance document that I mentioned earlier is anchored to core guiding principles. And for all of you familiar with the work of PBIS or MTSS, the small screenshot up in the corner should not look unfamiliar to you. It should be very familiar. And at the center of all the work is an emphasis on equity. So we see that being the priority of every decision that we're making going forward. And for us, multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, which PBIS is an example of, is a really helpful framework for supporting students, their families, and educators back in school as we think about making sure that our supports are being delivered in a way that's equitable. In particular, we can use the MTSS framework to think about what are those supports that work for all, what are the supports that we need to layer on top of that for some, and what are the most intensive supports that a few may need. And while we're used to seeing this triangle applied to academics or social, emotional, and behavioral needs or supports for students, this same logic works as we think about our families, our educators, or at the district level as we think about organizing supports for schools, and at the state level as we think about organizing support for districts. So this logic really allows us to make smart choices as we're thinking about systems and practices, about what tier those fall in, and kind of in between tiers as well, so fully building that continuum. And again, we see that as a mechanism by which we can achieve equity. The other really important thing is we're going back making all of these decisions, and it's so nice to see this represented in many of the state's guidance, is to think about student outcomes being the forefront of all of our decision making, right? So thinking about student growth and student benefit, but we'll expand that a little bit, and you'll see this in future talks, in thinking also about staff wellness, staff benefit, and family wellness and family benefit. To achieve outcomes, we implement evidence-based practices, and in a time where resources are stretched and we're trying to do so much, we want us to come back and think about not trying to do everything, but focusing on a small number of relevant practices that have an evidence base to suggest they're going to work for all. And now more than ever, think about the integration, the alignment, and the connection among those practices so we can maximize the efficiency, but also the effectiveness of our work. To know that we're on the right path, we need data to guide our decisions. So data, thinking about screening data to guide who needs what, thinking about monitoring data to ensure it's working, and thinking also about data on outcomes and fidelity, so how well it's working and how well it's being implemented. And last but certainly not least is our focus on the systems that support our staff and thinking about, again, reinvesting or doubling down our investment on those systems that allow us to enable and support high fidelity implementation of those practices we've already identified. So again, that was a lot of content, but this graphic should ground us in knowing that all of this is familiar to us, and it all comes back to these concepts of equity, outcomes, data systems, and practices. The other way we've thought about this work is thinking through the implementation cascade. So I mentioned already, I was thinking about this kind of as the zoom function on a map. So thinking about those supports that we provide at the state to support districts, districts to support schools, schools to support classrooms, and ultimately all of that to benefit individual students. But built into this cascade also are important feedback loops, which are always critical, but especially as we're learning together through uncertain times, having those communications so we're seeing what works and for whom at each of those levels becomes critical to inform improvement across time. And we've already mentioned the concept of leveraging existing systems. This is a graphic that for many of you looks familiar because it comes from the PBIS implementation blueprint. And we think about, for states, districts in particular, those executive team functions about making sure we have the capacity to do the work. And then at all of those levels, including at the school level, thinking about those implementation functions to make sure we're providing enough support to educators to implement practice as well. And at the local implementation demonstration level, celebrating successes and sharing what we've learned, right? So this systems logic plays out across time. In this guide, we've thought about where we might need to tweak. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but there's great content in the guide that gives suggestions about ways to tweak or enhance these different features for the current context. You all will also have the opportunity to do a deeper dive on the concept of staff wellness when Susan Barrett joins you later this month. So she'll be applying the MTSS logic, thinking about how to support social, emotional, and behavioral needs of all, including staff. So I think you all will love hearing that content. But for the rest of today, we're going to slow down a little bit and we're going to focus on those critical practices. So the few things we can do to set students up for success. And one of the things we've kept talking about in the groups that have been doing this work, and I'm sure you all have been talking about back in your states, district schools, is thinking about doing a small number of things really well. Again, we can't do all the things all the time. We have to be really focused. And in my prior life, before being a professor at the University of Connecticut, I directed a small alternative school that served students all identified with disabilities that had crisis level behaviors. So they did pretty significant injury to self or others, and that's how they came to us. And so when we had a bad day, those days would be pretty bad. And one of the things that we learned was rather than trying to layer on and make things more complex, after a bad day, we would come together as a staff, whether it was an individual classroom or a whole school, and have a conversation about back to basics. And as I was talking with my colleagues, thinking about this time of kind of summer and preparing to go back to school in the fall, this same kind of mantra kept coming up. This idea that when, again, times are uncertain, it is helpful for us to anchor back to a few things that we can do them really well, and then monitor to make sure that they are working. And when they're not, we can use data to adjust or enhance. So those few practices that we centered on were connecting. And by connecting, we're talking about students, educators, and families all being connected together. We talked about the need to screen. And that may not mean investing in formal screeners, because different districts and states have different levels of capacity for that. But screening in a kind of idea of how do we identify who needs what level of support so we can better adjust and plan for what we need to provide when we go back to school, and we can better kind of pivot as over time as we continue to screen. The third practice we talked about was support, and there's a lot that fit into this practice. So again, thinking about those things that we do to support students and educators to set them up to be able to teach, which was our fourth practice. So how do we integrate social, emotional, and behavioral instruction into high leverage academic practices to make sure, again, that students are set up for success? And finally, how do we use data to ensure it's working? And if it's not working, again, use data to adjust or enhance our practice. By doing those 5 practices together, we see that we can create positive, predictable, and safe learning environments. And those concepts ring true whether you are a school or a district that has embraced PBIS, multi-tiered systems of support for behavior, social emotional learning, trauma-informed care. Those ideas of positive, predictable, and safe ring through all of those different approaches to really become the cornerstone of effective environments. So the title of the talk was Effective Environments, but by effective, we mean positive, predictable, and safe. And by doing that, we can realize student benefit, not just academic benefit, but also social, emotional, and behavioral benefit. So our goal is to achieve growth in all of those areas. So in the guide, and I'm just sharing this with you because I'm about to share some resources, all of the resources are hyperlinked. So any resource that I mentioned during the talk today, you will either get or you will have access to by going through the guide and following those hyperlinks. And as you can tell from this very busy screenshot, there's way more in this guide than I will talk about today. So please spend a little bit of time doing a deep dive and kind of seeing what's there and identifying what will be useful to you. So with that, I would like to spend the rest of today's talk walking through each of these practices. I'm going to talk generally about what the practice looks like. And in several places, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the critical features. By no means am I going to cover it all. So again, please reference the guide to get a more complete picture. So the first practice we talked about was connecting. And especially now, but really always, this becomes so important in the work that we do. So we're talking about relationships between and among educators, students, and families. Part of creating relationships and maintaining them is having effective communication. And especially at times that we're distant, we have to be really purposeful in how we check in and connect with families and students. So some of the resources that had already existed include one called Positive Greetings at the Door, which is actually as simple as it sounds. So it's the idea that we greet students as they enter a classroom. We have a short positive interaction. It's a chance for us to connect, to maybe provide specific praise, maybe to provide a prompt or reminder for expectations, and then we set them up to enter the classroom with their first activity. And the way I just described that, you're likely picturing a physical classroom, but those same exact elements can be implemented if we're in remote instruction. So as you'll see a theme across a lot of the resources, our goal is to focus on critical features and think about how we can pivot those across different contexts, whether we're in in-person learning, remote, or some version of hybrid in between. A second resource is one on adapting check-in, check-out for distance learning. And those of you who know the framework really well are thinking that's a tier 2 resource. That's true. We are seeing we might have more students who benefit from that right now, so it's a great thing to think about for tier 2, but I'm actually sharing it for a different purpose. And that's because there's a really nice, efficient checklist that we borrowed from Missouri, thinking about kind of family wellness and how you might structure a connection or a check-in with a family. So this is one example. There are many out there, but especially if staff don't have a habit or a routine of how to connect, this allows them to get some information that might guide decision-making. So it's an example of a really informal screener and a way, again, to think about structuring a check-in. We also have resources that many of you have seen and used around connecting with families. The second one pictured on the screen on the right is an ebook that has lots of good content around how to develop relationships and how to actively engage families, not passively, when we're implementing PBIS. And you all have another fantastic opportunity coming up in August, and it will also be recorded and posted for folks who are watching this in a recording, around building relationships with families. So that is such a critical piece. I did not do it justice, but you are going to have an entire talk on that piece coming up. And the part I wanted to end on within connecting is the importance of being intentional with our connections. And this is kind of a cute handout, as I'm calling it. So talking about how to be socially connected while physically distant. And one of the things we're learning from childcare centers, from hospitals, from different settings that have not paused, is that relationships are impacted when we are literally masked for nonverbals. So a lot of the ways we rely on communicating with each other are a little bit more informal, and facial expressions carry a lot of the meaning of our language and our behavior. But when we're literally masked and not able to see those, we have to be more intentional with creating those relationships. So whether it's pivoting greeting at the door, or taking a handshake to a wave at a nice distance, or instead of just counting on people to see you smiling, stating, hey, I'm smiling and this is why. So really thinking about how we can be intentional with creating those positive relationships. And again, this is a nice illustration of us focusing on critical features and thinking about the function or the why of what we're doing instead of the form or the specifics of what it looks like. So if we think at those critical feature levels, we'll be able to pivot pretty successfully most of our effective social, emotional, and behavioral practices. So that is our first key. It's around making social connections and being really intentional with those connections and those relationships. The second key message is that we need to have information to guide our decisions about who needs what level of support. So if you think about screening, not just as formal screeners, as we've said already, but as a process to identify need and support, then we have a lot of information already from spring, and we can collect information as we do those check-ins with families and students to help guide our decision-making that allows us to then differentiate and intensify supports. So I'm going to do a very fast version of resources on screening, but there are lovely webinars from folks like Kathleen Lane that go into depth about how to pivot screening into a new environment. So one of the great resources is on pbis.org, And that's just an inventory of different social, emotional, behavioral screeners. It has content also about price. So some of them are free, and those are certainly the ones we like to use, but there are some that are a cost. Not all of these have been validated or used for remote contexts. So that's one of the things to kind of think about and use a little bit with caution. Our friends and colleagues at the National Center for Intensive Intervention also have tools charts. Some of those charts cover behavioral screening or academic screening. And those are, again, really nice resources because they give a quick inventory of the various resources that are available or that have submitted into their system. And it talks about kind of the different levels of accuracy or trustworthiness of the data from those tools. And there are also great guides from our colleagues at the National Center for Improving Literacy on best practices. So again, lots of information to do a deeper dive on screening. So I'm going to kind of pause on that topic, but know there's a lot more content available elsewhere. Where I'm going to spend most of my time is in this one. So when we think about what are the social and emotional and behavioral supports that we need to put in place to set students up and staff up for being ready to learn, it comes back to those same key messages we talked about. It's about positive, predictable, and safe. And we're thinking about teaching both expected behavior, but also key social, emotional, and behavioral skills, which is abbreviated with SEB just so that fit on the PowerPoint. So social, emotional, and behavioral skills that help students navigate kind of the context they're in. The other thing that we've recognized across time is how important it is for us to connect what we're teaching in school with home and community settings. And especially now that we have students in home settings for some, or in some places all of the time during learning, we need to be even more intentional about understanding the cultural and contextual implications of home to community to school, and being thoughtful about taking that into consideration as we're designing our supports, and also adapting what we're doing based on our local context. So as we walk through some of these pieces, there are some things that have not changed. So when we think about designing a safe environment, forever we have talked about thinking about minimizing crowding in the classroom and distraction and maximizing structure and predictability. These are almost exact quotations that came out of a paper we wrote in 2008. And so in the past, we've always defined those around arranging furniture for traffic flow, thinking about supervision, thinking about staff versus student areas, thinking about seating arrangements. So those are some of the critical features we have always talked about. As we pivoted into the new context in spring 2020 and looking especially forward to coming back to school, those same elements show up. We just have slightly different contingencies around them. Right? So we're still thinking about our furniture arrangement or physical design, but we have a different view to safety than we did before. We're still thinking about minimizing crowding, but we're now putting on this filter of 6 feet distance. We're still thinking about staff and student areas, but we might now be thinking more specifically and precisely about students having their own space and their own materials. And our seating arrangements have always been thoughtful, but we're now being really careful about different kind of levels of distance, again, depending on the phase and the levels of need in your community at the time. So just some examples of what that's looked like, all empty classrooms or empty areas. But we see in the middle kind of the traditional older school classroom, and we're now seeing more spacing, we're seeing more thoughtful use of space, and we're seeing more prompts that are physical. So for example, the arrow that says walk this way, to help ensure students and staff are prompted of the expectations and can do those things safely. So they just become second nature and they don't have to become the focus of instruction once they've been taught and practiced to fluency. Another really important piece is positive, predictable, and safe, right? So predictable routines. And we've always talked about the importance of having teacher routines, thinking about the importance of having student routines. The example in the picture is from the Netherlands. So this is something that's a universal part of how we think about designing schools that are effective for students. We also ask educators to be thoughtful about transitions and minimize the downtime. So making sure transitions are smooth and also as quick as possible. And we've thought about how we can not just define, but also teach and practice those routines and transitions. And as I'm using those examples or walking through that, Some of what we're likely picturing again is our kind of typical setting back before we had a break in our routine. But a lot of these things have not changed dramatically, right? So these are what routines have always looked like. When we had students all head home in the spring, we then send out guidance for families to think about how do we do this in our homes. So these are examples of an elementary school routine or a secondary school routine for families supporting learning in the home setting. And now I think one of the things we're all thinking about is how do we do this across contexts? So how are we thinking about routines, not just when we're in person and together, but also when we're remote, and especially when we're going back and forth between remote and in person. So in those hybrid moments, we're going to be thinking really carefully about routines. How do we teach them? How do we prompt them? And how do we tie them into our expectations, which is our next piece. So all of you who are in schools implementing PBIS or other school-wide models to support behavior likely have already established a small number of positively stated expectations. And we think about those small numbers of expectations being critical so everyone can remember what they are, and positively stated so we set students and educators up to focus on what we want to see instead of what we don't want to see. In thinking about how we're going to teach those, one of the things we ask educators and students to develop, often together, is a matrix that includes examples of what the expectations look like in the context of routines. So many of you watching this will already have matrices developed in your school that talk about the different physical locations. You might have a column that talks about field trips or other activity contexts. And one of the things we've seen schools do really effectively is pivot that to talk about different contexts. So in the spring, we created a resource around how to use the teaching matrix to teach expectations during online learning. So this resource gave an example of what it looks like to be safe, respectful, and responsible when you're entering class, when you're doing teacher-led instruction, during one-on-one instruction. All of this is in the context of remote learning. So same idea, same critical features, but just pivoted into this new context. A second example, which we've liked a lot, is one that we think could extend across in-person, remote, and hybrid environments because it has examples that include school-based settings. They also include remote instruction. And again, for hybrid, we're in between all of those. So the matrix is a really useful tool for us to think about exactly what the behaviors are that we would like to see. And again, define those within the context of expectations and also within the context of routines. Once we have the matrix, we shift to thinking about how we will explicitly teach those expectations. And by teaching them, teach them in the natural context. So if we're talking about online learning, we're going to be teaching that when students have access to remote technology, even if we're teaching it when students are with us in the fall, right? We might be teaching the expectations to set them up for a hybrid experience or to set them up for a return to home environments. And so we're going to actively involve the students, and we're also going to give them a chance to practice in that context so they have a chance to be and experience success. So here's a couple of pictures, obviously pre-COVID, where we have educators teaching the expectations in the context of a classroom or in the context of an auditorium. The next parts, as we all know, teaching is not a one-time thing. So we're going to not just teach it once, but we're going to reteach it across time, especially as we enter different new or difficult routines, and every time we transition between those. So if we're kind of fluent and good with implementing when we're in person, but we're about to shift to hybrid, we're going to take a moment to reteach. Even after we've taught and retaught, those prompts or reminders become critical. So catching things before they're going to happen, reminding students and ourselves what's expected. And again, prompts work the most effectively when they're tied to previously taught behaviors. A second component of that effective kind of teaching piece is following up by monitoring closely how student behavior is going. So we're familiar with the concept of active supervision, and that's typically defined by moving, scanning, and interacting. So in a typical classroom setting, we're moving around the environment, we're constantly looking, so kind of the idea of our rear view mirror, we constantly check to see how things are going. And we're taking opportunities to interact briefly to both reinforce or praise what's going well, but also to quickly redirect if students are heading into a kind of poor choice or a challenging behavior. One of the things we're noticing is obviously if you're in an online environment, probably movement is less critical, but the scanning and interacting piece is still critical, being able to supervise all of your students. I've seen teachers pushing different technology or remote options to think about how they can be more effective to let teachers, for example, monitor all breakout rooms at the same time. So really thinking about how active supervision at the critical feature level can transition from in-person to remote environments. And just some really simple examples, getting students actively engaged and creating the reminders, delivering the reminders. And as the parent of a kindergartner who got to watch kindergarten class meetings happen, the importance of prompting was so apparent. So when the teacher thought to prompt ahead of time, set clear expectations for student engagement, she actually had most of the students most of the time remember to take turns as they were sharing. The lessons where she forgot to provide that reminder were chaos, right? So those simple prompts transition to online and in-person learning. So once we've taught and we've reminded of the skills, the next part is to catch things that are going well. So providing specific feedback when things are going well would be specific praise. Providing specific feedback when a student makes an error is an error correction. So why do we talk about the importance of this? The first reason is it works. So we know that specific feedback results in desired outcomes for students. It also allows us to continue teaching. A second reason is that it helps us build that positive climate and relationships that we've already talked about. So taking those opportunities to connect at an individual level with specific feedback helps us enhance the connections and relationships. The one thing we ask teachers to be mindful of is the ratio. So we've seen across decades research that talks about there being more positives than correctives. We've seen ratios kind of suggested that go from 4-to-1 to 5-to-1 to 8-to-1. And more recent research seems like a pretty magical ratio, hence the unicorn, is 5-to-1. So if we're thinking about providing 5 positives for every corrective, it helps us think about really being thoughtful and catching students doing the behaviors that we'd like to see, providing the correct responses that we'd like to see, instead of only responding when we see an error. So in terms of critical features, we think about specific praise being that positive statement that specifically names the behavior and happens quickly after the behavior occurs. Error corrections actually follow a similar formula. So again, they happen after the behavior, they provide information. The slight difference with error corrections is we don't usually have to think about being quick with praise, but we often have to think about being quicker with error corrections. So our goal is for those also to be brief and concise. The other piece is error corrections should be calm, they should be private, and they should be instructional in their focus. And what I mean by that is the content of the error correction should give the students the information to set them up for success the next time. It should not just be about stopping the behavior that happened that one time. So error corrections and praise should be contextually and culturally relevant. So some students, especially maybe older students, might not want to be called out publicly with specific praise, but they still would benefit from it being delivered in a private, calm, or even written manner. So again, really thinking about praise and error corrections being contextually and culturally relevant, but error corrections always being calm, private, respectful, and instructional. So some examples, thinking about specific praise, including things like nice hand raise, clear pronunciation, helping your friend was kind, and specific error corrections, again, giving them what to do instead. So for a student who talked out, instead of talking out, please raise your hand. For a student who mispronounced a letter sound, that sound is A. What sound? Yes, A. Or rather than laughing, please help your friend clean up the mess. In addition to praise or error corrections, there are other strategies that we can layer on top of them. So the specific feedback is the non-negotiable, but in addition to specific feedback, we can think about acknowledging appropriate behavior with a behavior contract, or we might call it a classroom constitution that specifies the desired behaviors and what outcomes happen when students engage in those. a group contingency that sets the same expectations for all learners, but lets them earn it based on who's kind of achieved that reward, or for some applications of group contingencies, everybody has to achieve the award, the expectation to get the reward. And the third example is token economies, where we might give students points or little bucks or coupons that they later trade in for a backup reinforcer. Those extra systems can be fun. They can be helpful during times that are challenging for students. You wouldn't ever want to do all of them because it would be overwhelming. And it might not be that they're necessary. So for many students, for most of the time, that specific positive feedback, specific praise is going to be the most critical strategy. On the flip side, there are other strategies we can think about to respond to inappropriate behavior that include purposeful or planned ignoring. So once we've taught the student a skill to get our attention, we can ignore the challenging behavior and redirect the student to the appropriate behavior. We can then reinforce when they engage in that appropriate behavior, which is the second strategy, differential reinforcement. And we can provide brief breaks or timeout from reinforcement contingent on problem behavior. Each of these strategies has pros and cons to it, so we won't go into all of those right now. But again, for all of these strategies, the most critical part is to pair them with specific feedback and to hit that magical ratio of 5-to-1. So our goal is to focus primarily on specific feedback, emphasizing positive over corrective, and making sure that we have 5 positives for every corrective. One of the things that I think can be overwhelming about that is when we say a ratio, how are we going to ever know, right? And so there's a really cool and free resource that was developed by some of my colleagues at the Center on PBIS in combination with folks at PBIS Apps. And it's an application called Be Positive, so BE+. It's available at both of the kind of major places that we buy apps. And what's cool about it is teachers can track their own behaviors. So if I wanted to know if I was praising or correcting at the right ratio, I could actually hit a button on my phone and count it. It also is something where we can set up prompts. So if we want to make sure we deliver one of those prompts or reinforcers, we could set up an alarm that reminds us. So it has lots of options to help support our practice. And for me, I think it's kind of a fun one to use. So we would suggest kind of playing with that a little bit just to see if it would be helpful for you. So all of those pieces that we just talked about under support have to be thoughtfully planned. And so our second key is this one. So I know in the screenshot it's super tiny, but this is a kind of basic plan for creating an effective environment in the classroom. As you can see in it, there is a matrix. There are prompts for lesson plans, and the second page is actually a blank template for lesson plans. There's a prompt to actively engage students in instruction. There are prompts for prompts, so it has some examples of what prompts look like. And it has some examples of specific feedback, so both praise and corrections. As you look at this, you can tell some of the text is light blue. So that is all sample text that we provided, kind of an extra reminder of what goes in each box. But the goal for this would be you would delete that light blue text and you would be able to contextualize this example for your own classroom or your own school. So you would write in your own expectations, your own routines. You would define those in the context of your own matrix. You'd write your own examples of prompts and your own examples of praise and correction. So hopefully this can be an effective tool to help you operationalize some of the strategies we just talked about around creating safe, positive, and predictable environments. The fourth practice that we're going to talk about quickly is teaching. So teaching is obviously a lot of what we do. And so the emphasis I would like to place during my portion of the talk is thinking about how we effectively teach and prompt the skills we want to see. Active engagement is critical, but especially how we interweave social, emotional, and behavioral, so SEB, social, emotional, and behavioral skills into our academic instruction. So it doesn't feel like we have to stop academics to teach a social skill. We might do some of our social skills instruction to set up academics, but then once we're in our academic routines and our academic instruction, how do we call forward and prompt those skills? And how do we reinforce both social, emotional, and behavioral and academic skills together throughout instruction? So one of the things that we've talked a lot about in our center is the importance of bringing culture and context into our instruction, and especially at older levels. You'll notice the resource on the right is geared toward high school. But I, as a parent of 2 elementary school kids, think even at the younger levels, bringing student voice into our instruction helps us make sure that our instruction is a better match for students and their families and our whole classroom. So the PBIS Cultural Responsive Field Guide has amazing tools in it. A lot of them are actually buried in appendices. So make sure, if you're someone who usually reads the content and skips the back matter, you don't do that here. So the resource I already mentioned really quickly around aligning matrices across home, community, and school environments is one of the activities in this field guide. There's additional content about how to think about the examples and materials we're using for instruction. So there is so much content in here that it would be a great one to download and read as we think about making our approaches more culturally responsive. A second key piece that our center has talked about and that I've already mentioned is that integration of social, emotional, and behavioral work into academics. So this is our third key. And this is actually a brief that Steve Goodman developed, and I had the privilege of helping support. But it talks through what it really means when we say integration of social, emotional, and behavioral content within academics. So this is another resource that would be great. It's only a couple pages long, but it gives some nice core features and examples of what it looks like to integrate. And way better than I would do at talking through this content is Anita Archer, who's going to be presenting the third webinar. And she is masterful at talking through how to engage students, how to use high leverage practices to reach most students, and how to use data to guide decisions about our practice. Just having to kind of switch and put on my teacher hat at home with my 2 kids, I've watched videos of her from decades ago around different core academic skills. So I just cannot speak highly enough about her, and I'm so excited to get to see her in one of your future webinars. All right, last but not least, we're going to continue to collect data to monitor how things are going and use that data not just to make sure it's working, but really disaggregate it, look at, is it working? If so, for whom? And if not, for whom? And how do we then use those data to enhance our supports within Tier 1 or potentially identify students who need more intensive supports and bump up to Tier 2 or Tier 3? And there are some fantastic resources on progress monitoring, again, from our colleagues at the National Center for Intensive Intervention. They've also taken the step of contacting a lot of the publishers of some of the more kind of established progress monitoring tools to think about which ones have some level of reliability or validity for use during remote instruction. So it's a great resource, not just to think about when we're in person, but also to think about which tools we could use to pivot into remote instruction. So again, our message is around coming back to basics, focusing on these 5 core practices as ways to create positive, predictable, and safe or effective learning environments to really help to support students' social, emotional, and behavioral growth. So as we just went through a lot of content the fast way, I think it's always helpful to take a breath and to think about that we can't do all the things now. Right? We started off saying the focus on back to basics was critical, but even within that back to basics, there was a lot of content. So I just want to give permission to say it's okay, and beyond okay, frankly, it's necessary to pick a small number of practices and to prioritize those, right? It doesn't mean it's all we're going to do all year, but we can think about what are the things we're going to focus on now. And to that extent, I want us to think about the 3 keys. And the way I selected these was thinking if I could do nothing else, what would be the 3 things I would prioritize? The first one, if you remember, was around connecting. So it was prioritizing those positive connections with students, with families, with educators, and really being intentional about creating social connections, even if we are physically distant. The second one was around creating effective, and again, by effective, we mean positive, predictable, and safe environments. And so we specifically talked about having routines, teaching expectations, and celebrating successes. So there are kind of 3 keys built into that one. And then the last one we'll talk about today is that integration of social, emotional, and behavioral support into academic instruction, so that all of our instructional moments are opportunities for us to also foster social, emotional, and behavioral growth. So with that, I would like to thank you very much. And I know there have been questions and answers for folks who are watching this live. Hopefully those have been fantastic for you all. And I believe we are coming up onto a break, and I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Brandy. That was wonderful. We are going to go ahead and take a break. It's 1:45 on my computer. We're going to start back up at 2 o'clock. That'll give people a chance to get up and move around a little bit. And when we come back at 2, we'll turn it over to our Michigan presenters.